coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
But what's just so amazing to me is the way the left has really exposed clearly their frustration, not even that they will have to listen to ideas that they don't like, but the idea that other people will discuss ideas that they don't like. Like, that's really what's bothering them. They can mute or block anyone they want. What drives them crazy is the idea, it's like, the old saw about Puritans unhappy that someone's having a good time. Mm-hmm. They're unhappy that someone somewhere is having a discussion that they can't control.
Hello and welcome once again to the Roundtable, your weekly publishers and editors podcast here at the American Mind. We have a full bench today, including a special guest. I'm Spencer Clavin, your host, features editor of the American Mind. I'm joined, as always or as usual, by our editor, James Poulos, our managing editor, Seth Barron, our publisher, Ryan Williams, and to help us break down a particularly vexatious podcast that has attacked us recently, we've got Glenn Ellmers, who's a senior fellow here at the Claremont Institute. I'm sure a lot of our listeners know him and his work already. If you don't, you should check out his book, The Soul of Politics, Harry v. Jaffa and the Fight for America, available wherever fine books are sold. And we've brought Glenn on, in part because we just like to talk to him, but also because we wanted to discuss this podcast episode. It came out a while ago now, but we've waited to respond to it until we could get the whole crew together. It's an episode of a podcast called Know Your Enemy, and the episode came out March 8th. It's called A Second Civil War ? With Jamelle Bouie. Jamelle Bouie's a columnist for the New York Times. You, again, may know him. I can't exactly recommend that you go away and listen to the entirety of this episode. We'll do our best to summarize it here for you. But the essential premise of it, as I understood the podcasters, it's three folks. There's Jamelle, then there's Matthew Sitman and Sam Adler-Bell. The podcast is called Know Your Enemy because, as I understand it, is about understanding the right, the modern right today. And that in itself is kind of an irony in the sense that this is, three leftists talking about what those nasty conservatives believe. It turns out they think we believe that a civil war is imminent and perhaps desirable. That it's never quite clear whether we're being accused here of wanting civil war or simply of predicting civil war. Those two things are kind of elided throughout the episode. Of course, many of our scholars at Claremont and just people on the right generally are talking about whether the disputes in this country are so deep and so foundational that some form of secession or, cold civil war or, there are many varieties of this belief, none of which is really well articulated in this podcast episode. But it's sort of insinuated that what's really going on here is that the right, and Claremont especially, is effectively just so incensed at the notion that Black and brown people should be able to vote and are becoming increasingly enfranchised, that we feel our grip on power slipping. And what we really want, at one point it's suggested, what we really want is a secession from society. We want to, we want to arm vigilantes, and failing that, we want to kind of carve out our own red state sequestrations in which we can, establish theocracy. I'm ranting now, so I'm going to start reading to you from the transcript, and maybe we can pull some clips also of this episode. And I'll start just with a portion in which Adler-Bell begins to kind of talk about his critique of Claremont Institute generally, and specifically the intellectual godfather of our institute, Harry Jaffa, famous and notable scholar of the Civil War, subject of Glenn's book. And, we believe really one of the most perspicacious student of Lincoln and of the history of that period really ever. But here's what Adler Bell has to say about Jaffa and Claremont. He says, this is starting to make me think that it reveals a real problem with the whole way in which the sort of Harry Jaffa school of thinking about what the conflicts that led to the Civil War consisted of, that it may reveal some basic fundamental myopias there. Because if you're thinking about the conflict over slavery in these abstract political, philosophical terms that are kind of like recapitulating debates from antiquity and not about the material interests, the deeply embedded material realities, these conflicting economic interests that were irreconcilable in the antebellum period, then you might think like, okay, slavery was this one issue that there was a political, philosophical disagreement about, and not thinking about it in the terms that Jamel is articulating, which is that it's not a political, philosophical disagreement. It's a fundamental question that touches every single aspect of the economic, material, social, and cultural life of the country. And then Sitman takes him up. Yeah, Sam, I think there's something to that. But I was rereading something today, Harry Jaffa's Crisis of the House Divided, his first book, mostly about the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And you're right, it's portrayed as basically a recapitulation of, Socrates versus Thrasymachus. Does might make right? Voted up, voted down. Or are there principles, deeper principles at work? So this is a moral crisis more than a material one in a lot of ways. And when you read Jaffa's book, there are chapters called like the teaching concerning political salvation, the teaching concerning political moderation and its ideas, morality, ethics. I do think that's a weakness of the Claremont approach, is it's so ideas-based. And I think you can see that then in, when we talked about the 1776 report that the Trump administration released, that was authored by mostly Claremont types, West Coast Straussian types. It's the entire history of the United States is basically a series of like intellectual permutations and deformations. It tends not to be connected to the material level at all. Now, I'm going to let the guys weigh in on all of this soon, but just to sort of kick things off with a few comments. Throughout this conversation, there was a weird kind of tension, it seemed to me, that on the one hand, we on the right, and specifically at Claremont, are wrong that civil war is imminent. And I should note, by the way, that most of us, in fact, all of us who think that civil war might be on the table, are horrified at the possibility and doing everything we can, including dedicating our professional lives to preventing it. But, first of all, we're wrong about this because the debates and disagreements that we have don't go deep enough to start a civil war. But second of all, we don't think the Civil War itself went actually all that deep. It's not just political, philosophical disagreements. It's a question that touches every single aspect of the economic, material, social, and cultural life of the country. But of course, that's precisely the argument that people who are worried about civil war in this country make. We say that, in fact, there are fundamental first principle level disagreements which touch every area of life and which then, do cause us to find ourselves increasingly unable to live together with one another, which is precisely what we're accused of in this podcast, that we're somehow, retreating from society, which it would be exactly what you might do, I suppose, if you thought that you couldn't live in America as currently constituted. Anyway, there are a number of attacks on various friends and Claremontsters here. Dave Raboy comes in for an attack because he's one of the people that's, I think, maybe most vocal about this concern. Helen Andrews, a friend of ours, who wrote a piece sort of deconstructing some of W.B. Du Bois's writing. She's accused essentially because she points out statistical inadequacies and flaws in Du Bois's reasoning and essentially rejects him as a model for racial reconciliation. It's sort of insinuated that she objects to Du Bois's claim that Black people are humans. I could go on, but I'm going to stop now and let the guys weigh in. Glenn, maybe you can start off here since you're the Jaffa expert. What did you make of this claim that he intellectualizes the 1860s too much?
Right. Well, the whole, by the way, can I be the first to say it's a little amusing to listen to a podcast called Know Your Enemy, sneering at the idea that anyone would think we're approaching a crisis of division in the country. First of all, on the question of ideas and morality, this is not something Jaffa invented. If you dispute that idea, you have to dispute Lincoln, and Lincoln's opponent in 1858 and 1860, Stephen Douglas, both of whom agreed, as did all their audiences in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, that slavery was the issue and that it was fundamentally a moral question, a moral and political question regarding the rightness of slavery and whether slavery should be put in the course of ultimate extinction or allowed to expand. And then no less a figure than Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, pointed out very famously in something called the Cornerstone Speech that slavery was the cause of the late disturbance. And again, not merely as an economic issue, as the podcasters seem to indicate, but as a question of right and wrong. So this is not something Jaffa invented. And it's hardly, by the way, mutually exclusive with material interests, which the podcasters emphasized over and over again in a sort of quasi-Marxist way. Of course, people who have strong material interests will often put a moral cast on it. And likewise, great moral issues rarely are separate from great economic issues. These things are great political issues are always intertwined between the moral and the economic or financial side of things. But the podcaster's notion that Jaffa alone somehow misrepresented this by making it a purely intellectual or moral issue disputes the explicit statements of the principles themselves.
To that end, I mean, I don't, maybe I'm being dense here, but I don't quite understand this distinction between, fundamental philosophical disagreements and something that would touch every aspect of life and community, American life. I mean, right. I get that, as you point out, it's kind of a neo-Marxist gambit, or it's a gesture of Marxist thought to suggest that when people claim they're talking about big philosophical concerns, what they're really doing is masking their immediate material interests with some kind of rhetorical window dressing. But even if that's the case, right, even if there were more pragmatic concerns at stake in the Civil War than just the rightness or wrongness of slavery, I mean, surely the rightness or wrongness of slavery is so fundamental a concern that it does, in fact, permeate every aspect of American life or any political community. And indeed, that is the claim that, as I understand it, most people are talking about when they say we might be heading for another civil war or another national breakup, right? Is just this idea that whether or not we understand ourselves to be materially motivated, our material interests are in fact coming into conflict precisely because we have these fundamental first principle level disagreements that are really motivating us.
Right, of course. I mean, the podcast is so shallow and all over the map. It's a little hard to argue with it and pin it down because they really never stick with one argument. But for instance, later in the podcast, they criticize the right for not being majoritarians. They wax on indignantly about the Electoral College, which of course is a merely instrumental complaint. If the politics were a little different, the left constantly toggles back and forth on the filibuster and the Electoral College and so forth, depending on what's in their immediate self-interest. But slavery is precisely about the question of rights and majorities and whether there are any limits on majority rule and whether a majority can rightly enslave or deprive a minority of its rights. And that's precisely the issue that then they turned around 10 minutes later and complained about the right for being insufficiently majoritarian. So, of course, slavery affected every issue of society. By the way, one other thing, they brought up Michael Anton, who we didn't mention also comes in for some criticism for a piece he wrote in the CRB. And Mike's argument, which I think is true, was that we're now more divided. And I know Ryan has mentioned this in some interviews before. We're now more divided than we were in the 1860s because we disagree not just about slavery, but about everything, about whether there is nature, about whether there are by nature men and women, about the purpose of government, about the rule of law, about individual rights, about just about everything. And the podcasters poo-poo that, but never even seriously entertain. In the whole podcast, they never seriously entertain the objections that those of us on the right are making and simply dismiss it.
I think it's pretty revealing, too, that, the context is Mike's book about Texas and California and about how they represent in some ways two different models. And the response from the three of them, from Bowie, from Sitman, and from Adler-Bell, is, most people don't move for ideological reasons. And they concede that right after that, one of them concedes, well, maybe that's actually becoming more true now than it was. But they sort of say, like, why would you go to Texas, right? Or why would you go to California? Don't Californians go to Texas and vice versa? And then Bowie brings up the point, like, and where are you going to go in Texas, right? You're going to go to Dallas, or maybe you're going to Houston. These are very different places. One is sort of a polyglot, multicultural city, and not necessarily the avatar of the older virtues or traditional virtues or any of that. And it leads them to this point, and I want to quote just a little bit of this and then tie it all together. I think it's pretty revealing. So sort of as a follow-on after the Texas stuff and after the stuff they said about Jaffa, Sitman says, I do think with the Straussians, because they're Straussians, the West Coast Straussians, the Claremonters, because they're indebted to Leo Strauss's thought, they talk about regimes a lot. But regimes are places where, pluralism and diversity, those can be a little dicey, right? Because a regime is a way of life. It's the way, a public, and what is the public order toward? What are the foundational values of the regime? What's the regime founded on? And it's kind of like when you combine that with the picking up the Lincoln crisis of the House divided rhetoric, and you even read the Anton book, he's clearly turning California and Texas into two competing models. Which way will the regime go? And I think it's a kind of category mistake, because the United States is almost like an anti-regime. We're too big and too diverse to just have one way of life that marks the entire polity. And then his colleague Adler Bell wraps this up by saying, and then you apply it to a republic founded not just on like antiquity's concept of a republic, but on liberal pluralism, on this idea that we must set our political sights lower because the conflict over what religion a regime should have and sort of what the fundamental values a regime should have. This conflict has produced so much violence in world history that you had to do something differently. So in a way, one of their ways of downplaying our conflict is to say, the country's a big place. Houston is super diverse. It's full of progressives. Dallas maybe a little more full of conservatives. But it sidesteps this question of overall in the political ecosystems of, say, California or Texas, are they different and are they tending in different directions? And is the political ecosystem of the national government in the United States tending in a certain direction? And they at times say that the right is disagreeing with the national trajectory precisely because it's trending in a direction that they like, while at other times saying any nervousness over that, however they may mischaracterize why the right might be nervous about the new liberal regime, is really unfounded, because after all, the place is large and polyglotnous, and so it's as much ado about nothing. And really at root, the anxiety on our side is just because we're really scared of multiracial democracy as they define it.
I like the way you put that. It seemed to me like listening to it and then reading it. Look, Marx came up with a very powerful, like analytical response to idealism, which is to say that like they're standing on their heads. Like, there's a material basis that has to be dealt with. And ever since then, degraded Marxists like to pretend that that's what they're doing. When they critique, people that they don't like us. So, they say, oh, Jaffa and the Claremont Institute are just mired in these fantasies of, the meaning of democracy and so forth. But where is the material basis that they're actually talking about that is so much more rooted than what we're talking about? Like you just said, Ryan, all they come down to is saying that, well, they're in favor of like multiracial democracy, and we're not. But they don't really the assumption is, well, whatever they like equals multiracial democracy, and whatever we like equals lost cause fascism of some sort. So it just seemed funny, this weird mental trick they've played on themselves, that as Marxists or quasi-Marxists or whatever they think they are, they can keep pulling this trick out of the bag and impressing their fans, but it seemed kind of empty. Do you see what I'm saying there?
I mean,
this thing about must be difficult to try to lay out these arguments without at all mentioning the way that institutional power has been completely culturally consolidated across every major industry in the United States and across the the administrative state, to the degree that there is a cadre of people in the government who cannot be removed from power, they cannot be replaced, they think and act in lockstep, and to the degree that public and private power have begun now to work together to create what is in effect a religious caste, complete with the most essentialist concepts of race, complete with a liturgy and various creedal statements that are expected to be uttered every day on the job, in the home, in school, in the court of law. This is a construction that Claremont has been tracking lo these many years, and it now defines the landscape. For people who are not so impressed by regime talk, they should look at the regime that the people who have the real power on their side of things have constructed.
Yeah, exactly. And that's exactly the point that I was trying to make, I guess, is that they just dismiss this idea of the regime without ever looking at what constitutes real power in America. There's this idea that the left has that, oh no, it's all the Chamber of Commerce has all the power. The billionaires have all the power, but those people are all on their side.
Yeah, I mean, this thing about multiracial democracy actually as a thread that runs through the conversation is really interesting to me, because multiracial democracy, it seems, means, real representative government, that without the current impositions, structural impositions that currently keep poor Black and brown people ostensibly from really having their voices heard, Republicans will be swept under by a coalition of the ascendant, and that's what we really fear. And so we wish to erect and defend these boundaries, barriers to multiracial democracy. But it's also a central point of Bowie's argument that many of the structural features of the American Republic, not just the Electoral College, but he talks about the structure of the Senate. He mentions the filibuster. I mean, and in fact, even more at a deeper, more foundational level, like the country is essentially founded on racial inequalities. And so the argument here is that Republicans are against multiracial democracy. America is structurally constructed to exclude multiracial democracy. And so achieving multiracial democracy is going to entail dismantling, root to branch, the constitutional system of America, which sounds to me a lot like Civil War and regime change talk, right? I mean, how is that not? If we're here to know our enemy, and if here on this podcast we're being told that what Republicans are against is like the good things, namely multiracial democracy, and the main obstacle between us and the good things is the way that America just is and has been since its founding, then why are we histrionic? I don't understand why we're being, hysterical then to suggest that what our ideological opponents want here is a foundational restructuring of the country of the kind that, as James indicates, in many areas of American life, they've already achieved.
Yeah, it's well, you get a lot of this on the left. I think there's the unstated premise is the progressive historicist premise, as much as, I mean, Sitman and I think Adler-Bell both are self-proclaimed socialists or communists. I mean, this is hosted at Dissent. This podcast is, or partly sponsored by Dissent magazine, a socialist publication. But the premise is that tyranny is no longer really a problem. So really the only thing standing, this is Bowie says at some point in this interview, his fundamental core political principle is full political equality or equity. And what he means by that is it comes out throughout this interview, and his interviewers, Sitman and Adler-Bell, seem to agree, is really plebiscitarian national democracy. And the premise so they must have the premise that that's an unfettered good, that really is the essence of justice. Whereas a lot of us who regard the older constitutional regime as wise in many ways, maybe even myriad ways, the whole point of it was to marshal constitutional majorities to preserve rights. And we've told that story over the years, and Jaffa has through his scholarship, recognizing, of course, the long problem of slavery and its hangover problems. So we never dismissed that problem for a minute. But at its core, the Republican system set up in America is meant to preserve minority rights while empowering reasonable majorities to effect good policy and pursue the common good and secure the nation against domestic and foreign enemies. So it's just another example of us, I think, speaking completely different languages. And I think there's I think a lot of us on the right understand and are less tendentious about the premises of the left than vice versa. I mean, I've listened to a lot of Know Your Enemy, and it's a normal tick of theirs too. They can be kind of reasonable and generous at times, and then they sort of quickly, and I think almost subconsciously, can just and do it kind of laughing with each other and sort of in moral and righteous indignation at the racist right. They kind of slide quickly into a tendentious presentation of our motives and our interests and our understanding of American history. So all of those are on display in this one, and I thought we ought to take it up just because we're all over it. On James's and Seth's point, I just wanted to quote a little bit more, partly because it brings up our friend Nate Hochman. Nate, who was a Publius Fellow last summer and has been a guest on this podcast. I think he's friends with Matt Sitman, at least. Maybe both of them. Adler Bell says the following: "That's one of the things on the right that's so striking about the rhetoric about national divorce or civil war." Nate Hochman, former guest on the show, wrote a piece for the American Spectator back in January on these themes. My editor brain kicked in, and I was like, gosh, Nate needed a better editor for this. So many things are just not really substantiated, including the piece's main premise, which is that the left just controls so much power, politically, culturally, and otherwise, that it's putting conservatives in this jam. And it's kind of that sense of just being out of power, and therefore what you do is really striking in the rhetoric on the right. That sense of powerlessness is so palpable on the right. Sitman responding, and I'm jumping through 3 minutes of recording. For the right now, they experience themselves as so besieged by the progressive totalitarian behemoth that controls every commanding height of our federal government, of our culture, of our corporations, of our economic world, that they cannot imagine a political solution to their experience of their own victimhood. That it's like we are so marginalized and our enemies are so profound and so empowered that we will not ever again regain power via legitimate means. And then Bowie jumps in at sort of the end of this segment to talk about this being even more crazy because of our recent political situation. This is Bowie. Now, one thing that's just kind of crazy about all this when I reflect on this is that in 2020, Donald Trump lost, sure, but he was the second highest vote getter in American history. He expanded his coalition across demographics. Some of this was probably reversion to the mean for some groups, but he appears to have made real inroads with Hispanic voters, and those inroads helped sustain the Republican Party at the congressional level. And so one view you could take the 2020 election was that Donald Trump may have weighed down the Republican Party, but otherwise the Republican Party is in pretty good shape. So it's like, this is Bowie wrapping up. Part of what is funny, crazy, whatever, everyone to put it is that Civil War rhetoric, this catastrophizing, this idea that if we're bound for national divorce, that there's this overwhelming progressive force that's suffocating any attempts of conservatives to hold power, is just belied by actual election returns. If you just sort of chilled out, you can have your cake and eat it too. And it just overlooks what James and Seth had articulated. And it's been one of the major themes of our podcast, which is, after a century or more of liberalism and progressivism, including this giant, behemoth administrative state that's been erected, that's fairly unaccountable to especially Republican presidents because it's overwhelmingly Democratic in its ethos and personnel. You can win national elections, but as we saw from 2016 on, if you're an outsider, especially like Trump, who was the biggest threat to the system in a while for various reasons, cultural and political, the permanent state with the Democratic Party as its sort of political heart will destroy you, will stymie your efforts to enact the policies that your coalition elected you to do. So this question of democracy or anti-majoritarianism, if you abstract completely from this huge piece of the modern state that's not really democratic at all, you're kind of putting the cart before the horse.
I was just going to say, they're so obviously comfortable with their own power, which they know perfectly well, but they don't want to admit. It's a little like the old Ancien Regime in France. They're so complacent their attitude towards the rabble is let them eat opioids. And it doesn't even occur to them to take seriously the complaints of the other side.
Yeah, exactly. And this idea that everyone should relax, all they want to do is return us to the original ideal of America, which somehow the Constitution and all of the institutions have like buried. Because the ideal is, equality for all, one man, one vote, like you said, like a plebiscite deciding everything. I mean, you hear this from like Obama, Hillary Clinton, like Andrew Cuomo. I love the potential of America. We love the dream of America. We love what America could be if it only lived up to its ideals. And its ideals are totally separate from the actual material history of the country, which is it's constituted by states. There's power sharing. There are checks and balances. We have a Senate. We have an electoral college. If you want to get rid of the electoral college, you hate America. You can't say that you love America and say that you basically want to eliminate states and just concentrate all of the power in, a couple of megalopolises. If that's what you like, then just say it. Don't say that this is the real ideal of America that you're trying to conserve or, bring out. So I think it's funny when they make this move.
Well, I mean, not for nothing, but Bowie is a major contributor to the 1619 project, whose explicit premise is exactly what you just said, Seth. That America's ideals were false when they were written. Black Americans, brought them to pass, helped make them true. And the ideals, it then turns out, are nowhere embodied in the institutions, especially not embodied in the existence of states, definitely not embodied in Madison's notion of an extended republic with multiple factions kind of compromising with one another in order to gain state power. None of that is, all of that is just an impediment, or in the kind of progressive formulation, it's just a stage on the route to a kind of apotheosis where at long last true equality will be achieved. And I'm sorry, but as Seth is saying, like, they mentioned 1619 in this podcast. They say, the efforts to attack Du Bois, to quote unquote revisionist histories of the United States, attack 1619, anything that, puts front and center this problem of multiracial democracy. I feel like the rhetoric of civil war, it can't be disentangled from that. And, I guess one way to get into this, it'll kind of connect some of the start of the conversation where we want to go, why isn't that as big a problem as slavery? So then, then Adler-Bell does start to ask, well, if they're against the notion of 1619, then why aren't they fundamentally opposed to us? And that does seem to give the game away to me. Perhaps I'm being dense, but it seems that if your vision of America is the 1619 vision, namely that most of our founding documents were not only false but deceitful. I mean, it's that they're there to either perpetuate slavery. The revolution itself perhaps was fought because there were abolitionists in the home country, and Americans didn't want to, get infected by by abolition spirit. If that's your premise, and therefore, a lot of these documents, if not all of them, are a kind of disingenuous window dressing, and the real Marxist analysis would get down to the heart of things, which is that they were just trying to protect their power. So now what we need is to clear all that away and just get to the heart of things, which was equality, an idea which we get from our founding documents. I mean, it just seems that if that's your explicit idea about improving America, then yeah, you want to wipe away America as materially constituted in history to play that game, right? And who is being the kind of abstract idealist now to be marching forward toward this utopian future that has never and anywhere existed in this country, according to them, and yet nevertheless, like, is what America, quote unquote, really is. And anybody who opposes that opposes America, and therefore is foolish to talk about civil war because they're simply going to be eradicated anyway.
It's hard to make sense of people who are fundamentally schizophrenic. I mean, one of the things that occurred to me while you were saying that is that Look, on the one hand, they want to do away with all the mechanisms that were supposed to keep runaway majoritarian tyranny in check, right? All the institutions, the electoral college states, other things that were supposed to protect minority rights and provide a check on majority rule. They seem to think, as Ryan says, tyranny is no longer a possibility. So they want to embrace just pure majoritarianism, plebiscitary democracy. And yet, it wasn't so long ago that these very people thought that Trump was an existential crisis to everything they held dear, right? Complete hysteria over the dark night of the soul and fascism that Trump was going to impose on America. So how can they think that and then, just a year or two later say, well, there's no need for safeguards. Let's just embrace a plebiscite.
I guess if I had to argue for them, Glenn, I think it would probably be, the only reason that we got to the brink of minoritarian fascism was because of these institutions. So if we get rid of them, the coalition of the ascendant will win forever or something like that. Yeah. But no, they also point out at the end that they claim that Republicans could still win at the national level, right?
Oh, right. Yeah, everything is fine because, in fact, we can still, why are we so concerned? It's just that we're being trampled under by a coalition of the ascendant. Well, I don't want to belabor this for any longer than we need to be wading through it. Are there any last remarks to make about this before we move on to some of our other topics?
I just wanted to close with this. You mentioned it at the beginning, Spencer, but they lament the laboratories of democracy, right-wing style that are currently underway. They bring up the what they call the abortion bounty bill in Texas, the stand your ground laws in Florida, the banning of the maliciously labeled, we would think, quote unquote, don't say gay bill in Florida for K through third graders, the CRT, critical race theory, curriculum stuff. The part of that whole argument is to say, while maybe the right is not fully secessionist, but it's like sort of micro secessionist. They want to secede in various ways in their enclaves from their multiracial neighbors, i.e., the stand your ground laws and this. At some point, I think Adler Bell calls it the ridiculous or absurd or atrocious law in Florida, which allows you to run over protesters. They kind of get to the brink of saying there are pockets being created in Texas, Florida, and elsewhere where the kind of white patriarchy can reassert its control over female and bodies of color by shooting people for no reason and running them over with your car. It sort of ends on that somewhat hysterical note, completely mischaracterizing a lot of this. I mean, speaking of the problem of majoritarianism or mob rule, I mean, the reason for the car rule in Florida was precisely the video that some of us saw of Antifa and BLM mobs, stopping cars and dragging the car owners out of their car and beating them half to death. Just the preposterous notion that one of them made that, part of the secessionary movement is in certain enclaves of the country, especially if you're white, you can just gun down people of color. I mean, without commenting at all on the merits of the case. That certainly wasn't the case in the Ahmaud Arbery stuff in Georgia, where those guys are spending 300 years in jail now on federal and state charges. So I just don't know what America they're describing. It's just a cherry-picked caricature.
Yeah, there's a weird gesture of psychoanalysis somewhere in there that, I think it's Bowie who says that these laws are really shoddily and quickly written, which indicates that they're acts of panic, essentially. That what's really happening here is a kind of racial paranoia at the thought of multiracial democracy, which, by the way, again, actual multiracial democracy, or rather a multiracial republic, is in no way something that anybody on the right is concerned about. Again, I just don't understand why they didn't have somebody on, like a guest on, who could articulate these ideas to them in the form that they actually appear, because literally zero people are sitting around thinking we need to have a civil war because what's about to happen is that black and brown people are finally going to have the vote in this country for real. There exist in this universe either zero people who think that, or else zero people with any platform or or power who are, Dave Raboy does
or
not
real
think
constituency.
That. Yeah. Exactly. Like that is simply not what's happening here. People are moving to red states because, and there's another moment when they're attacking Anton. They say, well, people aren't moving for ideological reasons. And it's like, well, okay, so your contention is that ideology basically boils down to material concerns. And then you articulate all the material reasons why people are fleeing blue states, high taxes, major disastrous policies in the public schools, to which one might add, feces littering the street and a ballooning homelessness problem, drug addiction going untreated, or having money thrown at it ineffectually by governors like Gavin Newsom. Like, what are those, if not ideological concerns? I mean, yeah, maybe the average person is not looking around and thinking, what this really shows me is that the Civil War was always about the rightness or wrongness of slavery. But certainly they are thinking, golly gee, I sure don't like the way that my state has been run into the ground by these maniacs who took my job away for 2 years and then told me to eat it while I sat on the couch watching Netflix, and as Glenn said, this sort of idea that you're just going to, either drug yourself into oblivion or entertain yourself with cheap pleasures isn't sitting well with people. They're fleeing to states where people will let them work, where they won't be taxed into poverty. And how is that anything but a realignment and a resorting? So, yeah, again, it does seem as if that the conservative picture of what's going on strikes me as exactly accurate and not actually any kind of, cover up for deep-seated racial anxieties, not least because, in point of fact, like the numbers are showing a remarkable racial realignment between the parties as well, especially among Hispanics, but just generally, folks don't like to be corralled, it turns out, into faceless groups and told that they're stamped either with victimhood or or oppression from birth. I don't know. It's just like that. Is that so crazy to believe?
No.
All right, very well. Well, I think we've discussed this now at sufficient length, and there are a couple other news items that I thought we could just touch on briefly. The first of which is that Elon Musk has purchased Twitter. We've been talking about this story for a while. We've covered it on a couple episodes, but we haven't talked about it since it actually materialized. He bought Twitter for $54.20 per share in cash at a transaction valued at approximately $44 billion. This has occasioned no small rejoicing, not only on the right, but simply among those who were concerned that there was some shady stuff going on in Twitter's algorithms. One of the things that Musk seems to want to do is to make those algorithms open source. And it sounds as if in the interim between Musk's actual takeover and now, there's going to be a lot of cleanup going on behind the scenes at Twitter, a lot of deletion of Slack messages and of code. I just from a purely anecdotal perspective, and I know that I'm not the only person who's experiencing this, I'm a Twitter holic, and I have, after the 2020 election, it became very clear that my reach had drastically reduced. I was watching people follow me in my notifications without my follower count going up, all sorts of the stuff that, people complain about, and you don't want to whine about it too much because it sounds like you're saying nobody's listening to me. But I will just say that the difference since this news was announced has been night and day. I mean, I'm actually watching. I'm not saying anything particularly interesting. As per usual, I have nothing of any interest to actually say, but the follower count is just ticking up without my doing anything. People are engaging again. That is in itself kind of telling, I think. But then we should be opening up this bigger conversation, I think, about, and we've published an editorial note about this on the site, so you go to AmericanMind.org to check this out. But, who is Elon Musk and what exactly do we want out of him? What does he want out of this? There have been a number of interesting kind of discussions about, is this our champion? Should we want him to be our champion? And I thought I would just bring that to the group and see what you guys make of this. Positive development in general, and what should be our caveats? ?
It's definitely a positive development. I still don't really see Elon Musk as our champion necessarily, although in this issue he seems to be on our side or helpful. What I mean, and people have commented on this, but what's just so amazing to me is the way the left has really exposed clearly their frustration not even that they will have to listen to ideas that they don't like, but the idea that other people will discuss ideas that they don't like. Like, that's really what's bothering them. They can mute or block anyone they want. What drives them crazy is the idea, it's like, the old saw about Puritans unhappy that someone's having a good time. Mm-hmm. They're unhappy that someone somewhere is having a discussion that they can't control. And that's obviously what's driving them crazy. And it's really enlightening.
I have a question related to that, which is all of us, and Mike Anton is a friend of ours who's written a lot about gaslighting, right? It's awfully tedious at this late stage to keep talking about the hypocrisy of the left. And yet there's an interesting, you might say, epistemological question. You see someone like Robert Reich, who says the diametrically opposite thing from one year to the next, right? About whether these social media companies are free markets or not. What's really going on there? I don't think all of this is gaslighting. And so at some level, do they just not notice that they're contradicting themselves? Do they not care? I mean, to the degree that we want to understand what we're confronting, I genuinely don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, Robert Reich's a good example, Glenn. I mean, they're tweets probably 2 years apart.
It's a mirror image.
Yeah, more or less. The first one being, don't all of these conservatives understand that, private companies can basically do what they want and have First Amendment protection? And then the latest one is, if you allow someone like Elon to take this over, it's going to be a problem for social democracy or whatever. Yeah, I don't know. Reich, I think maybe we just chalk that up to, you might tweet a lot over the course of 3 years. And the nature of the medium itself encourages unthoughtful self-contradiction, I think.
Yeah, but then how about that? What's this guy, Memler, the CNN guy, who was talking about, well, someone in control of Twitter could turn down some opinions and turn up some opinions.
Oh my gosh,
yeah. And
that was magnificent.
Election.
Yeah, I think that.
And it seemed completely unaware, or was it?
I think someone like that would have regarded our warnings over the last 3 years of Twitter doing precisely that, only against the right, as histrionic and false, maybe. But now it's a real possibility because, that's what it is, right? It's basically who controls it. If our people control it, it's presumptively legitimate and above board. If some wild man, with suspect opinions who is way too rich and, wants to take us to Mars gets a hold of it, then it's a whole different story. The real inflection point with Musk in the culture wars seemed to have been the collapse of his relationship with that Grimes woman, where he tweets like, pronouns suck, and then she's like, I love you, but please call me, stop tweeting, stop hating. The beginning of his just mocking rejection of the current regime happened, started a couple years ago when he started getting more active on Twitter. And that the culmination is now this. He bought it.
Yeah. Is that the world's most consequential celebrity breakup to date? It must be up there, surely.
I think so.
I do love this thing where it's suddenly like one person can determine who gets to say things in moments of great consequence for our republic. Like, nobody should have this much power. Throw the ring into Mordor. Like, suddenly this whole, Jack Dorsey himself must be like, tearing his non-existent hair out, because this is exactly what he himself, to his credit, whatever other complaints I have about him, this is what he's been saying, And my feeling is like, yeah, I do sort of think that nobody should have this much power over what has clearly become the digital public square, buttressed by government carve-outs and funding. And you hear the way Jen Psaki talks about these social media companies. It's like, who will rid me of this meddlesome priest? Like, who will cancel these meddlesome disinformation agents? And she talked about how the administration was in talks with Facebook to flag certain posts because they didn't like the misinformation they were spreading about the COVID vaccine. So yeah. I would rather have somebody in this position. Like, I actually think conservatives generally, so far as I can tell, as they were with Trump, are very clear-eyed about who Musk is. Nobody's out here saying like, oh, the great conservative hero. Many people are worried about some of the stuff he has in mind for us, the brain implants and driverless cars and all these things. But if this is going to be a kind of Götterdämmerung between these, vastly powerful gajillionaires, obviously Musk is the imperfect vessel, just as Trump was the imperfect vessel for his moment. And great, like, let's see where it leads us. I genuinely don't know, and I'm always I maintain at this point a certain agnosticism about, like, do they not hear themselves, when people get on CNN and say, like, I can't believe the possibility. I mean, you could even, I don't know, you imagine he could even kick the president of the United States off of Twitter if he wanted. Like, imagine that. What a thought.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's just obvious that what's going on right now in the United States, in the West, and around the world is a global struggle for control over digital technology at the highest levels. And we'll see how it shakes out with regard to Musk. He's, you can't really arrive at that level without a powerful and unique combination of individual peculiarity and organized backing at a very high level. There are different factions at play. Twitter has been described as the digital public square. America created technologies that have reduced America's status. I mean, it's if we're talking about one public square for the entire planet that exists on one platform that's controllable by one individual, then American political discourse becomes just kind of one sub-channel or one flavor in that mix. And that is historically not, regardless of exactly where you would pin yourself on the partisan spectrum, that is not what American politics is supposed to be. And I think to the degree that technology poses a radical challenge to the practice of human politics as such, conservatives and others are right to be sort of wary and not prepared to, pile out into the street and throw ticker tape parades for anyone. But at the same time, all this is happening in a certain sense because of the Babylon Bee, and I think whether he's being strategic or sincere on a deeper level, Elon Musk seems to understand that beneath the controversies over free speech are more foundational controversies about compulsory speech and about the imposition of an established creed or religion by a regime on people, perhaps a majority, perhaps a significant majority of people who do not want to be converted at sword point, so to speak.
Yeah, and it's also worth noting, I think, that in this conversation, well, Musk's not really a conservative, right? I don't think that Musk is trying to deceive us about that. I mean, he may not agree with Claremont or the conservative movement generally on everything, but it's not as if he's out here trying to sort of trick us into idolizing him. And there's always this sense, I think, people talk about this way with Trump too, like, oh, conservatives have just they've worshipped Trump. They've really fallen for worshiping the golden calf. And yeah, like there was a golden statue of him at CPAC. There was some of that. But actually, if you talk to the majority of conservatives with Trump, they were like, well, he has some real flaws, but we're in a dire moment. And this guy is the imperfect messenger. Norman Pohortz compares him to King David all the time. This flawed human who's, got a role to play in God's plan. And like, that's basically how conservatives regard Trump. It's also, again, like, all these accusations like, these conservatives are just falling for the next billionaire. They said they were against tech magnates and now they're in the pocket of Musk. Like, nobody's really saying that. They're saying, all right, we live in a fallen world. This is the imperfect situation on the ground. And Musk is our best shot. He says he's in favor of free speech in its absolute form as defended by the First Amendment and further by our norms of public life in this country. And it seems like he's quite sincere in that, to the tune of, many, many more dollars than I personally have or am willing to wager on almost anything. And so, all right, let's take a shot on him. And I this thing where the reports of Musk worship, like reports of Trump worship, have been greatly exaggerated.
Yeah, it's I think it's a positive development overall. You can take your bearings by a few things at least, which is the regime's reaction, if you permit me that term. DOJ, I don't know if it's serendipitous, they were planning on doing this already, but DOJ has now announced a disinformation division. Psaki has now reinvigorated as we mentioned, the discussion of Section 230 reform of big tech. So I think it was useful to do it, even to try it, even if he didn't. Frankly, I didn't think he'd pull it off, but that is Musk. But it was a useful thing because any way you can shake up this argument over speech in the public square and big tech's role, and in a way that exposes the hypocrisy, but I'll put a star on that and come back to that in a minute, of the left, I think is useful. Glenn, in response to your hypocrisy question, I forget who coined this. We've all seen it. Maybe I first saw it on Twitter. I can't remember. Whoever coined this, forgive me. But it's the saying that it's not hypocrisy, it's hierarchy. And so it's sort of a fancier way of saying something like when you've controlled the levers of cultural and economic power for 50 years, when you continue to control them, you act a certain way. And when little pieces of them are snatched back or look like they're going to be snatched back, you kind of grab any argument ready to hand to try to regain the hierarchy or regain your former position. So it's not that you're contradicting yourself. It's that this status quo that you thought would go on forever and you think as of right and as of world history and as of divine providence should go on forever somehow has experienced some blip. And so you're justified in deploying all means, tendentious or not, to try to rhetorical and physical to try to take it back.
Are people who think that way capable of constitutional government?
Now we're veering into the Civil War talk.
No, I think they're fine with ruling and being ruled as long as the trajectory of history keeps going their way, right? And that seems to be one of our fundamental divides.
Yeah, I mean, that level of question is precisely why we are talking about, the threat, the looming threat of civil war, right? I mean, here's a great example of the depth of our disagreements and the seriousness of the moment we face. But I don't know. I'm generally quite sanguine about this Musk discovery, and I think that it's telling when, as Seth said, it's most telling when people are not only not sanguine about it, but like horrified as if this is the end of the world, that somebody should be running a major platform according to free speech norms. That is all the time that we have for today. Thank you so much, Glenn, for joining us. You should check out Glenn's book. It's called The Soul of Politics, and you can get it on Amazon or wherever books are sold. And with that, thank you all for listening to The Roundtable. If you want to learn more, visit our websites at claremont.org, americanmind.org, clermontreviewofbooks.com, and our DC-based Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. That's DC-based in every sense of the word. You can donate to support the show at claremont.org/donate. And don't forget to rate, review, share, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. I'm going to pound the table about that one this week. It's really helpful when you do that, when you give us a 5-star review, when you let people know about the show. It helps us keep doing this, which we love to do. So don't forget to rate, review, share, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks, everyone. Talk to you next week.